Now it's time for Q&A. Daryl Greenfield, Ph.D., Professor of Psychology and Pediatrics, University of Miami, will be answering questions about his presentation, Making Science and Engineering Visible in Early Childhood. Doctors Doug Clemens and Julie Sarama are the moderators.
Thanks so much, Daryl. That was, as usual, just great. It was so exciting to hear you do patterning. Also important to mathematics, engineering, as you well know. It's definitely interdisciplinary kind of skill. But you started with a pattern that's kind of A, B, A, B, that kind of repeated pattern, and then showed us so many things that are patterns and structure in different ways. It's so important for people to understand those sequential patterns, but then branch out. I loved it. We have a couple questions, Daryl, and can I start you off with a friend of both of ours, Alyssa Lange, asks, are there any formal efforts to create national park pre-K or 0 to pre-K standards that align to the NGSS?
There's nothing really being done at the national level. As you know, most of education is controlled by states, and the states can typically follow the K-12 framework. A lot of states are adopting the K-12 framework. And what a number of states are doing is they're looking at their early learning standards. Each state typically creates them, and a number of the states are starting to revise their early learning standards to get a greater focus on STEM and science. I know we've done that in Florida. I know that a group in Massachusetts is doing it well. I've seen a group in Nebraska do it. So there's nothing really at the national level, but states are doing it. And if your state hasn't done it, maybe you should try to encourage them to think about spending some time revising the STEM standards, making STEM more of a focus in early childhood. And you could even look to see if your state has already adopted the K-12 framework, and maybe make a suggestion that you could look at what we've done to create that sort of continuity between the K-12 system and our adaptation to that for infant, toddlers, and preschoolers. And to the extent what we've done with that adaptation is we've used exactly the same three-dimensional approach. The notion that children, even at a very young age, should learn by doing. They should be learning concepts while they're doing it. They should be learning core ideas in the science areas, which they're already very interested in. They want to know how the world works. And the degree to which we've modified that is just to make it more developmentally appropriate. Think about what infants are doing, what toddlers are doing, what preschoolers are doing to make the kinds of activities relevant for those particular age groups.
Thanks, fantastic. Peggy had a couple questions. The first of which is, what is your favorite resource for educators who work with infants and toddlers, young toddlers?
The 0 to 3 website, as I mentioned, has a number of resources, some of which are available at no charge. So the two that I posted in my second last slide, those resources are available. And we also posted on the last slide, and I'm happy to share those slides, and I think also the presentation is being shared. You can look at the resources we've already created. We've always had in our project, which up until COVID-19 had a large focus on working in classrooms and working with the educare centers that are part of our project. But when COVID-19 started, we switched to putting more emphasis on social media. So we increased our presence on our Facebook page, on our YouTube, on Instagram, and we also have put a lot of those resources on our webpage, which we're now also updating, which we'll have an updated version of that in another month or so. But those are good places to start. And if you have very particular questions, we also provided a Qualtrics link where you can just fill out your contact information and what your questions are, like what you would like access to, and we can then respond and provide that to you.
That's great. Laura asks, what ideas do you have for encouraging exploration and science engineering concepts in a virtual environment?
For very young children, I would suggest having them directly interact with objects. It's for those of you that have been spending sort of some amount of time now trying to do online learning with young kids, it's quite challenging and very difficult. And you usually need an adult to sort of often just help them navigate the Zoom and navigate having the audio on when they want to talk and so forth. But at a very young age, as you know, children begin to grasp and grab objects in their natural environment. So they're very curious, and that at some point they start to crawl, and then they can stand and they navigate, and by a couple years or so, or even by a year of age, the precocious ones are already walking, and they constantly want to interact with objects. So that's an incredible opportunity for the adults around them to encourage using sort of the science language to have the children, even the very young ones, sort of hear the connection between what they're experiencing directly with objects and the language that goes with that. So infants always want to put things in their mouth, and you can put some soft thing in their mouth, and you can describe the attribute that they're having. Oh, that's squishy, or that's soft, or that's sour, or that tastes bitter. So they're hearing the names of the sensations they're having, or if they grab some object that's hard, or a squishy toy, that's squishy or that's soft. They'll pick up objects. They'll often toss them or bang into them. A ball might bounce, and you say, "Oh, look at the ball! It's round. It rolls." So I would not really spend lots of time. If it's necessary, you could do that. But what you could do is get them, if you're on a virtual platform with them, like a classroom teacher, ask them in advance to get some object that's of interest to them, and then they could explore the object and get the adults to talk about that. There is somewhat of a misconception among parents that science, as I mentioned in the video, science is not really for young children, it's for older boys, which is clearly not the case. If you actually watch young kids and you take our framework, you'll see the children engaging in observations. They're planning and carrying out investigations to see what happens if they toss the ball to you or they drop something. So they're actually doing science practices, and the concepts of structure, function, and cause and effect are right there to make them visible. And they're learning the properties of the physical properties of objects. They're learning about the people around them. They're learning about their environment. So the science is there, and it's very easy then for adults, instead of thinking science is not happening with young children. And if I did want to do science, what I would need to do is I would need to figure out an experiment to do with the children. I'm not quite sure what that would be. I then need to go to the store and buy materials. I'm not quite sure what exactly those would be. That's, a trip that I don't have time for. Then I need to set up the experiment. I probably won't set it up right. There's probably one and only one correct answer. I'm not sure what that is. The kids are going to ask me questions. I don't know what the answers are. It's going to make a big mess. Like, this is really not a good idea. I shouldn't be doing science. But on the other hand, if you get the adults and the parents to sort of pay attention to the everyday routines that are happening, the routines are beautiful and wonderful opportunities to use the talk of science to the kids. So just for example, like suppose you're having breakfast with your infant and you're in a hurry to get them to daycare, obviously not happening now, but at some point. And they're the point where they can start using utensils. So they have a spoon on their high chair, and they pick up the spoon and they look at it and they lean over their high chair and they drop the spoon on the floor, and the spoon makes a little sound and sort of bounces. And the father who's sitting with his daughter is now, don't do that. That's not for dropping. You need to eat with that, and picks the spoon up. And what does the child do? Child takes the spoon again, picks it up, looks at it, and drops it. Now, one way you can think about this, the parent can think, well, my child is defying me. I said, don't do that, and the child is doing that. What am I going to do? Well, okay, I'm taking the spoon away. But if you look at that from sort of a lens of science, what you're seeing is that your child was interested. Here's an object. I wonder what would happen. Can I hold this and I drop it? What does it do? So it's a cause and effect relationship, and it was an interesting effect that occurred. The spoon made a sound. It bounced a little bit, And as a good scientist, the infant says, well, maybe that just happened once. I need to replicate. You need to try that again to see if it's going to do the same thing or something different. And if a parent sort of looks at that from a lens of science, they might say, well, my child is actually doing science and experimenting. Maybe I should take a napkin and hand the napkin to the child and say, well, no, let's drop this. Let's see if it does the same thing. And the napkin does something different. So there's lots of opportunities. Just think about riding in the car, brushing your teeth, preparing for bed, taking a bath. These are all routines that happen on a regular basis, and they're all opportunities, to use a lens of science to begin to have your child hear that particular language. And again, the important thing is they're trying to make sense of their world. So when they do something like they splash their hand in the bathtub, you can talk about like cause and effect. Like, you made the water to splash. You did that, right? So you're taking what they're directly experiencing in terms of what they're doing or the attributes that they're feeling. Here's a little rubber ducky, you squeeze it, it's soft, it makes a sound. Oh, look, you squeezed it, it's squishy, it made a sound. And you can imitate the sound. So children really learn language best when you connect the language, and the language is connected to their direct experiences. And there's all these opportunities to do that at a very, very early age. And as children, continue to develop at the very young ages, they're really sort of very interested in kind of discovery and exploration. Like, what are these things, to explore their world. But at some point, as they get a little bit older, become much more intentional in their behavior, and that happens in late toddlerhood and preschool. Then they begin to do actual investigations, right? They take on agency.
Let me pose this one to you, Daryl, in case there's something you wanted to add from what the great stuff you already said. Miss Eva says, many early childhood teachers have a fear of the term STEM thinking that it's beyond them. Do you have some additional resources that point out that the STEM's in front of them that they don't actually see because they don't know? I really think you addressed that already, Daryl, but if any further thoughts about anxiety and the like.
Well, you're absolutely right. That's a good question, and it's an important area. And one of the things, if you actually look at this report, Early STEM Matters, we have, in addition to our 4 guiding principles, which I shared with you, we have 6 recommendations, one of which is around messaging. So part of it is to do a better job of providing short, meaningful, consistent messages to adults about what STEM actually is and why it's important at a very young age. But what we end up doing, which is very effective, is that the programs that we end up working with, we start out doing some training with modules that we have, just sort of an introduction to the project. But then we go and visit them, and we do 2 days of live face-to-face interaction. And the first day we come and we greet them and we ask, it'd be okay if we just sort of hang out at your center, go into your classrooms. It'd be all right if we take some pictures, and videotape a little bit of what's happening in the classrooms. And typically they often apologize and say, we know you're here to help us with science and STEM. We're kind of anxious about that. We don't really see how we have time for it. There's all this pressure to work on language development, and math is also an area that is being pushed, which is actually a good thing. But to some extent, if you kind of look at the literature, the notion is that even when you get into elementary school, language and literacy in some sense is like the curriculum bully, and that it takes up really all of the time. And there's actually now some nice sorts of presentations that talk about a kind of a mutuality in which language and literacy and math and science and social and emotional development can all happen in the same context. But what ends up happening then on the next day, we start the training and we present the framework to them. What we do as one of the activities is we start showing them videos, and we eventually show them their own videos. And what we ask them to do is watch the video that we've taken of what's happening in your classroom, say during free play. And what we want you to do is after you watch the video, we're going to give you this form that we have that's called Looking for Learning, that has a section that says practices, another section that says cross-cutting concepts, one that says core ideas, and then another one says, other good pedagogy? What other things do you notice is happening? And then we ask them to watch their own video a few times and to back map what they see in the video onto this sheet of paper. And what they actually end up doing is they see that their children are engaged in lots of practices, that even though they're not sort of focusing on this, there are clearly opportunities for the adult to talk about the fact that, you just caused this to happen, or you're investigating, how this ball is rolling down this ramp, and you raised the ramp, and what did you notice when you raised the ramp? How did the ball react? And as a consequence, what you end up seeing is that teachers begin to realize, wait a minute, this is actually happening in my classroom already. And in addition to which, they see children cooperate and work together, ask for advice from adults. They're using their executive function and approaches to learning skills. So a lot of this is happening. And what is nice about the framework is that the framework is not a canned curriculum. It's not something that says like, okay, whatever you're doing, stop doing that, and then start doing something entirely different. But rather, what the framework says is that science opportunities are everywhere, and that the way you should engage children in science is based on what they're interested in, what is locally available, and what is the culture of the children and the families that you're serving. And you can use what's already happening to make science more visible. And we have some of our sites that we're working in, they already have existing curricula, some of which are curricula that you have to follow various sorts of themes. So you do a month on some activity and a month on the next activity. And we don't stop them from doing that because, their program has decided we're going to use this curriculum. But rather what we end up doing is we take the content that they're doing. So maybe they have a section on building with blocks, or creating RAM structures for kids to play with. What we end up doing is giving them ideas about how within that particular theme you can make science more visible. And then typically what ends up happening is a theme focuses on often sort of learning some facts or trying out some things. And then when that theme is over, you go to the next theme, and the next theme is usually not connected any way to the previous theme. So children typically don't often remember what the previous theme was about because the context has changed and the theme is now about, like, maybe it was pumpkins and now it's about something else. Whereas if you start the theme by webbing and thinking about, like, what questions do children have? We're gonna do pumpkins because it's October, but what do children want to know about pumpkins? So you can spend some time asking them, what questions do you have? And once you sort of get a sense of the fact that the questions need to be investigable, you can think about which are the good questions that you can clearly investigate, which ones are more difficult to do, and you can choose the ones that you can investigate, and you can focus on a theme that ends up answering children's questions, so you're drawing on their actual interest, and you can highlight a cross-cutting concept. So when you're opening up pumpkins, you could talk about its shape. You can open it up inside, like, what do you think is inside the pumpkin? You can find seeds, and you can talk about, well, do you think other fruit also have seeds in them? You could investigate that. You could talk about what happens when you open up the pumpkin and let it sit for a while, the whole notion of stability and change. You can talk about the fact that the outside of the pumpkin is very hard. Why is that structure? Why are there some other fruits like a strawberry where you can just eat it? Other ones like bananas and pumpkins have a shell. What's the purpose of having that protective shell? And is that something that happens a lot in nature? And then when you go to the next topic, you can bring back that same cross-cutting concept. You can talk again about the cause and effect, or the structure and the function, or the stability and change. So then what ends up happening is, instead of having a set of sort of isolated solo themes across the school year, what you're doing instead is you're connecting children's knowledge, and you're reinforcing these concepts, these important concepts that you want children to learn, because these concepts are not just science. I mean, if you end up taking a career in STEM, that's great, but everybody deals with, regardless of what you do in life, deals with cause and effect, and paying attention to patterns, and looking for structure-function relationships and thinking about how systems work. So, these are things that are important. They're ubiquitous in life. They're not just for science.
Excellent. Meg asks, has work been done on all of the cross-cutting concepts, like the work you showed with patterns?
Well, what we need is a stronger research base on these cross-cutting concepts to get sort of a sense of what Doug and Julie have done, the tremendous work that they've done in math and understanding learning trajectories. So we haven't really had the time to do that as yet, although we're beginning to work on that. If you actually look at the K-12 framework, they don't really give you a huge amount of information on the trajectories for cross-cutting concepts. So the cross-cutting concepts are a part of every grade. What's happened with the K-12 framework, it's been translated into an actual sort of set of standards. They're called the Next Generation Science Standards. And that's basically the application of the K-12 framework. And they do it in age bands. So there's a K2 age band, and then 3 to 5, and then middle school and high school. And at each particular age, they have activities that are to some extent developmentally appropriate, because they think about, like, what are the kinds of activities and content that children in kindergarten can learn. And they also have some amount of thinking about developmental appropriateness for the practices, like to what degree can children engage in observation and document, when are they able to start reading, their ability to plan and carry out investigations. But the cross-cutting concepts are the things that have been least researched. And over time, people are actually doing this. There's focus on looking at learning progressions in elementary school. And science and STEM activities are currently not happening to the extent that we would want them to in early childhood. We're hoping, people like Doug and Julie and those of us that are arguing for the importance of STEM starting at a very young age is hoping to change perceptions of the adults that this is actually something that's important and sets really good foundations for children's learning and developing understanding. There has been a movement recently in developing what are called 21st century thinkers, with the whole idea that lots of the problems that our children and our grandchildren are going to face, we don't even know what those are. It's like, who would have sort of thought about what's currently happening now? And we want children not to be stuck in, they only have certain skills and can only do certain things, but rather to get them to be problem solvers and creative and thinkers and, have flexible approaches to learning and be able to use their executive function skills. And STEM areas are things that reinforce that. When you're doing, for example, building ramp structures to roll marbles or cars down ramps, which children absolutely love to do. They will do that continuously, for months at a time. You can give them these interesting challenges. And what's nice about physical science is you get immediate feedback as to what is going to happen. So, for example, we've got children that say want to build a ramp structure that goes entirely across the block area. So they build the ramp structure, and typically they'll build a structure that just goes straight across. And then after you do that, you could say, well, that was nice, let's take that apart. Or you could challenge the child and you say, could you make the marble, instead of going straight, can you make it go off to the left and land in the cubby just to the left of the one where it's straight? And the 3 or 4-year-old will look at you and say, oh, well, that's an easy thing to do. They go and take the last ramp piece and they just move it. So now it's facing the cubby, and they roll their marble down the ramp, and to their amazement, the marble, when it gets at that intersection, it doesn't go left, it just goes straight. And they look at that marble and they wonder, like, wait a minute, why didn't that marble do what it was supposed to? So they'll pick up the marble, they'll try it again, and the same thing happens. And they go, well, maybe this is something wrong with this marble. Maybe I'll try another marble. After just a few minutes with experimenting with 2 or 3 marbles, they realize, well, that's not happening. There's something wrong with my thinking. I need to figure out why the marble didn't go where I thought it was supposed to go. I guess the marble didn't know it was supposed to make a turn. How do I do that? And what they end up doing, they typically like things to go fast. So they're they create their ramp structure so that the marble moves really quickly. They realize, oh, I need to block it. I need to put something there so it doesn't go straight. But then it often hits that thing and then bounces off, and they figure, well, what can I do? Well, maybe I need to slow this down. So they'll start changing the elevation of their ramp. And then, in a 5 or 10, 20-minute interesting and motivating activity, they want to keep doing this because they want to know, like, how do I get my teacher gave me this challenge. How do I get the marble to go off? They'll end up figuring this out, and they'll be very flexible in their problem solving. They'll learn, I need to block it. I need to figure out exactly how to block it. I need to slow it down. I can't slow it down too much. So they've learned a lot about being creative and problem solving and how to communicate in the context of doing things that are fun and exciting to them, because it's exploring and investigating their direct real world.
Super. I ask this, a very different kind of question, Daryl. How do you frame differently between science activities and STEM? For example, some people view observing leaves and worms or floating and sinking as part of STEM, while other people don't, since they're already been in the classroom and maybe were science. I'm a bit confused, she says, distinguishing science versus STEM activities.
Well, one of the things that you could do is take a look at the report that we wrote entitled Early STEM Matters. And we spent actually 2 years working on that report, and we had a wide variety of input from people in science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as dual language learning and other areas, early childhood, developmentally appropriate practices. And we talked about the fact that STEM is an interesting acronym, because at one point it sort of puts this together. So people, if you learn the concept STEM, you're thinking about science, technology, engineering, and math is going together, which is useful to some extent. But then it's also a bit misleading, because each of these areas are their own discipline. So science is not the same thing as engineering. You kind of think about science as basically learning how the world works, and engineering is the application of some of those science principles to solve human desires and needs, right? So like how do you get across a river? Building a bridge. So if you build a bridge, there's science principles that are involved in thinking about how to build a bridge. So there's science involved, but it's really an engineering project, right? And what's interesting, I think, about it is that some people think about STEAM as well as STEM. And when you look at bridges clearly are functional, right? You don't want a bridge to fall down. But at the other hand, most of them are gorgeous. They're beautiful. So, people are thinking about not just I'm not going to build just a functional bridge that's ugly. I want my bridge to be beautiful.
I love Jasmine's final thing, which you can maybe answer in a few seconds. Will STEM work for children with disabilities?
That's a really excellent question, and it's a very general question. And I think what you need to do is really look at each individual child and sort of look at their capabilities. What senses do they have? What senses can they use? And how can you, and what direct experiences are they able to engage in? And then how can you take advantage of what they're capable of doing and what senses they can use to make STEM visible to them? When you say visible, you think vision, but visible is not just vision. It's all your senses and all your understandings and your thinking processes. So making it as visible as how for a particular child with a particular disability, how can we get them to directly interact with their world in a way that we can then help them understand how to do that better, given what their capabilities are.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for sharing your afternoon with me, and please feel free to reach out to us, with additional questions. And thank you, Doug, for hosting this, and thank you to STEMI for inviting me to do this.
Oh, you're terrific, and it's such an important area. Thanks, everybody, and keep up with STEMIEFest. There's a lot more to come.